Hey, I'm Sarah, and this is the Goddess in Training podcast. This isn't about being perfect or polished or having it all figured out. This is about what happens when you actually start listening to your body, your intuition, your patterns, your truth. I'm asking big questions and having real conversations, sometimes messy and sometimes magical, with people who've lived through it, grown through it, and still don't have all the answers. If you've ever doubted yourself, betrayed your gut, or wondered if you're the only one, you're not. Let's talk about it. Welcome back to Goddess in Training. I'm Sarah, and today's episode is incredibly special to me. I'm joined by someone who helped shape not only my professional path, but also my sense of integrity and activism, Reverend Barry W. Lynn. Barry was my boss for over a decade at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. It was my first job out of college, and I started out answering phones and filing papers. By the time Barry retired, I was leading the fundraising team. In many ways, Barry watched me grow up. But Barry's story stretches far beyond that office. He's an ordained United Church of Christ minister, a constitutional lawyer, and a lifelong advocate for free speech, reproductive rights, and marginalized communities. His three-part memoir, Paid to Piss People Off, Peace, Porn, and Prayer, is a wild and wonderful ride through decades of activism, unexpected friendships, courtroom battles, and backstage moments with musicians, comedians, and even presidents. In this episode, we talk about the women who've shaped him, the power of music and mercy, his lifelong support for LGBTQ+ rights, and how listening, with compassion and curiosity, can change the course of someone's life. We also touch on the importance of intuition, honesty, and how to stay grounded in decency in a world that often seems determined to divide. This conversation is full of stories that will make you laugh, shake your head, and maybe even tear up. It's a tribute to legacy, to conscience, and to the revolutionary power of simply giving a damn. Let's get into it. Thanks so much for joining another episode of Goddess in Training. I'm Sarah, and I'm so excited to be joined today by Barry Lynn. Gosh, I worked for Barry for over a decade at Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and I think Barry watched me grow up. It was my first job out of college, and I started off as just basically administrative, and by the time Barry retired, I was the interim head of the development shop there. And Barry and I have a lot of other things in common too. We both attended Dickinson College. We both met our spouses there. Barry had a much more successful marriage than I did, but still, we have that commonality of Dickinson College. So anyway, I am just so thrilled to be talking to you today, Barry. So thank you.
It's very nice to join you and to see you again.
Yeah, so you've been retired for quite a while now, but you are still all over the place. And today we're going to be talking mainly about your trilogy called Paid to Piss People Off. It goes through your life, and we'll get into the details of peace, porn, and prayer and all the different aspects. But I wanted to start out, you in the book just speak so lovingly about both your mother and your wife, Joanne. And while working with you, I had the privilege of meeting so many amazing women: Cecile Richard, Dolores Huerta, Gloria Steinem, and in addition to comedians, Tig Notaro and Sarah Silverman. A little bit about the influence of the women in your life and how they have shaped you.
You know, I think it was Ginger Rogers who, when asked about Dancing with Fred Astaire, said, "Well, I do everything he does, but I have to wear heels." And I think women are at a position of needing to do more than men do just to be taken seriously. And I have always hated that. I hated that with my daughter, who's another wonderful person. I think you may have met her once or twice. But I mean, she's a lawyer now. To walk from the 1950s to the 1970s and see the extraordinary difference and the development of women in every profession is just masterful. But they have to work harder. You have to work harder than men do who just waltz in and then people assume they can do the job. It's the same with singers. I mean, I did something while you were there, and one of the reasons you met some of these women was we did a thing called Voices United for separation of church and state.
I'm wearing the t-shirt for people who are watching.
You're wearing a blue t-shirt. I only have red t-shirts. But the idea there was to an extraordinary person. I was actually having a Thanksgiving sandwich once with John Jennings, who's now sadly dead. I said to him, "Do you think we could do a fundraiser featuring singers and do it at some place in Washington?" And he said, "How about this? How about doing at least 50 shows, one in every state, all on the same weekend?" And I looked at him, frankly, like he was insane. And I thought, who would do that? And I had met Katie Curtis, this wonderful singer-songwriter, and she said, I could do this. And she's such a beloved figure in the acoustic music world that nobody said no to her. Somebody said no to me, but nobody said no to her. And I still see her, but she was described in one magazine as a folk rock goddess. And she's actually going to be up here doing a show in August. As part of one of the things I've been doing is trying to, as an ally of the gay community my whole life, we're doing a concert. Katie's going to be in it. Cam Paris, one of my favorite blues singers, is a wonderful guy who spent 38 years as an elementary school teacher. And then now he mainly does his blues stuff and works in concerts. But so we put together this concert. It's going to go for 5 hours. Music means so much to me. I don't play an instrument. During COVID, I took 5 guitar lessons from this wonderful singer-songwriter named Caroline Cotter, who lives up in Maine. And I was so fascinated by it, but I can't play more than like 3 chords. But as they say, 3 chords, that's a song, at least the kind of songs I listen to and enjoy. I I just wish that people understood how important the people that help nonprofits are. I mean, everybody did not work literally for nothing, but in general, because you really can't expect a musician to give up a play at a major city. That may be the only one that she or he even has for a year. But you can just make an arrangement, and we always, had a successful series of events with one exception, which we could talk about. But these singer-songwriters are just the nicest people in the world as a group, as a class of people. And it's just an astonishing collection of people. And we did that first year, we had 50 concerts. So people got upset in Mississippi. They thought it was too controversial an issue, separation of church and state. So they bowed out. And then one of Katie Curtis's friends, who was living in Maine at the time, she said, well, where can I go and do it? And there was a lesbian bar down in Mississippi, and they had a wonderful time doing it. But those are the kinds of things that I think that the staff, with the exception of you, probably thought, oh, this is crazy, waste a lot of time, and why is he doing this? But I think it was every time I see somebody up here, we go to a lot of music concerts, that did something for Americans United. I always go up and they always remember it so fondly. And I think that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. And I mean, it's the same with actors. I don't think actors always appreciate just how important it is for them to come and speak at an event, or for them to write a fundraising letter. Because late Phil Donahue, did a fundraising letter for Americans United. It was a very popular letter. And it was
that for years and years and years.
yes, I think we did. I think we did. My mother was a very strong person. I mean, she married very late in life, but she was absolutely an enormous influence. In some ways, more than my dad, but I love my dad. He taught me so many things. And the main thing he taught was to be a decent person. You cannot go through life hating people, and you have to cut them a break. I always did that, no matter who I was doing talk radio with, whether it was Pat Buchanan, Oliver North, a guy named Pat Corton who died a few years ago. They were really conservative, principled conservatives, not these people that float around now and decide, well, I think, let me just be contrary. I think I'll vote for Trump. But these are very principled people. And I always found, and I think this is very important, find one thing that you agree about, and then, and don't go for the conversion experience. Just stick with that. It makes a breakthrough difference. Pat Buchanan and I hated the trade deals that were being done during the Clinton years. And it wasn't unusual. We'd sit around a table for an hour with Ralph Nader and me and Pat, and we'd all agree that these are very dangerous for American workers. And with North, it was the death penalty. He opposes the death penalty under all circumstances, as does one of my old nemesis, Jay Sekulow, who worked, of course, for Pat Robertson and was actually in the first impeachment trial for Donald Trump. I keep forgetting his name. I keep thinking it's Elon Musk, but that was like last week. But you find these things, and then it does really build another layer of relationship that, and as I say to, my twin granddaughters are up here, and our neighbor had a Trump sign in his yard, and we have them to dinner, and they've had us over to dinner. And one of my granddaughters, we often take a walk about this hour of the day, and she said, but they support Trump, and you and Grammy don't, and my mom and dad don't, but you have them to dinner. And I said, yeah, because you can't hate people just because they have a different political outlook. And I think it's very important. And then I think it's important also because every once in a while, you can have a genuine breakthrough with someone. And that happened for me with a guy who was probably the most effective anti-choice when it comes to reproductive justice, anti-choice man, because most of the anti-choice spokespeople are men. And he would just, he would set up a pulpit outside the Supreme Court. He'd wear a collar because he is a minister. And he would just get a lot of attention because he was very articulate. He had on a collar. He represented something called the National Clergy Council. I never figured out what that was. But all of a sudden, he changed his mind. In part, he told me, because of conversations we would have. But most importantly, he was in jail, a DC jail, not a good place to be. But he was there for some kind of illegal trespass, and 4 cells down from him was an African American woman who had 3 children who was pregnant again. About an hour into her incarceration, she started to wail, to moan and wail, and being pastoral, said, "What's wrong?" And she told him the story. I have 3 kids. I can barely afford to feed them. I'm pregnant. I can't have another child. That encounter changed his entire life, as if he had never spoken to someone who had this compelling reason to have an abortion. And then from there, he changed and became a church-state separationist. If people go to my website, which is www.barrywlynn.com, you can see an interview I did with him where he talks about, maybe some of your listeners remember, he was the guy who used to link up heavy donors for the Republican Party with Supreme Court justices. And he looks now upon it as a terrible thing that he did. But he did it for many years and he was very good at it. And all of a sudden now he's run something called the Bonhoeffer Institute. And it just changed his life. And when you think about it, repudiating your entire career uh, is a pretty amazing thing to do because you lose your friends, you lose those contacts. But he's gotten a lot of new friends now, and it
Yeah, that's something that you don't see very often at all.
no.
That's really, really remarkable. And Barry, the thing that struck me the most when I was rereading your books is just as you were especially starting off your career working for Amnesty for those who defected from the Vietnam War, and you had such access in Washington. You told a story about how you called up the White House and were able to talk to the chief counsel of the president, and you could walk into senator's office and you could have conversations and people saw other people's humanity. I think that is gone. It's completely
Yeah.
gone in Washington. What do you think about that? And is there a way we can turn that around?
I think one of the practical reasons why there's so little communication between Democrats and Republicans is because if you're elected to the House, for example, you don't usually move to Washington. But in the old days, you move with your family. So your kid and some Republicans' kid, they were going to the same school. It's that connection, that breakthrough that say, this is a human being first and maybe a politician second. But you don't see much of that these days. And you mentioned about the White House. I mean, after Jimmy Carter offered the pardons for war resistors and then deserters, those are the people who were actually in the military, gone for 30 days without permission, and they were mustered out easily and got a discharge, a bad discharge. But the first day after it was signed on a Friday and Saturday, a woman called me and said that she had just heard from a guy who was trying to come from Canada back to the United States in order to go to his grandmother's funeral. And he was stopped at the border and he said, but I've been pardoned. And they said, well, you've been pardoned for resisting the draft, but you also have another charge, which is flight to avoid prosecution. And I said, it's horrible. I said, I don't know. It's a Saturday. I'm going to just call the White House. So I called the White House to talk to a guy named Bob Lipschutz, who later appears actually as a board member of Americans United for Separation of Church and
I
State.
didn't know that.
Yeah, well, that was probably predated your arrival, but no, so I asked for the counsel of the president's office, Bob Lipschutz, and he answers the phone, and I suspected it was him because he said, this is Bob, and he had a southern accent. And I told him what was happening. I said, this is an embarrassment, and it's an embarrassment to the president. He said, okay, I'll take care of it. The next day, Bob is on Face the Nation, and the host at the time says, how'd this pardon go? And he said, well, we did run into one problem, but it's been fixed. That's what you do. If you have power and you want to exercise it, you fix things. Now, I wish the loyal opposition party, the Democrats, might be just a little bit tougher on trying to stop the things that Trump is attempting to do to all of us, not just for us, but for future generations. And they're not. And to me, that's a sin.
Mhm.
And I think these old words like sin and evil, are words we ought to use now because that's what we're seeing. I was at an Americans United event a few months ago, and I said to its new director, who do you talk to in this administration? And she said, well, nobody. There's nobody that you can talk to. In the Bush years, the Reagan years, there were those people
Yeah.
that you could talk to. And Sometimes I mean, there was a guy who worked for Bush. He was his chief of staff. And every time I'd talk to him, he'd go, well, Barry, I hate to think what you're going to ask me because, we don't see eye to eye on much of anything. But he would listen. He would listen. Listening, that's step number one. And then what happens from that, in these rare instances, it's spectacularly different so that all of a sudden someone changes their entire position on everything. But sometimes it's just a little thing that you can work on.
Mhm.
I compromises, I'm in favor of them if they're creative. Prior to Americans United, I worked at the ACLU. I'd like to say I was working on issues nobody else wanted to work on, mainly because I didn't have to go to a lot of meetings to do that. But you would have people come up to you, I mean, really good-hearted people, and they'd say to me, I know you wanted me to vote no on this, but I just couldn't. Don't worry. You guys, meaning lawyers, you'll take care of it in court. That's not a good answer
Yeah.
because every person elected to any branch of the federal government has an obligation to make sure that she or he believes that there is something constitutional about the legislation they're considering. And you don't get away with saying, go to court. And of course, now the courts have been so deeply polluted by these appointees that it's hard to get it. And back in the days that we were both at Americans United, we'd win cases. We'd win cases. I was having dinner just last week with a guy who we represented. He won his case. But by the time you get to the Supreme Court, it's just polluted. I mean, there was a big case about school vouchers where one of the conservatives had to or felt that she had to recuse herself because she had a close connection with one of the lawyers on the other side. But that's very rare, and that was a kind of a split decision, and it upheld a circuit court, which is one step below the Supreme Court. But if it comes back again, she won't recuse herself because she won't know the lawyer on that side, and I'm really afraid of what will happen with that. No, I mean the courts are really important, and notwithstanding that people say, including the Chief Justice, well, there are no Republican judges and Democratic judges. That's a lot. You get very technical here. That is bullshit because you can predict anybody who follows the court. You can predict the outcome in almost every single case.
Yeah.
And so now we have 6 people who are barely constitutionally literate and 3 people who are, and those 3 decisions really hurt, really hurt.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to not be depressed all the time about all of these things. The other thing that really struck me with your book is, your first job was with the United Church of Christ, and
Right.
churches were political back then in a way that was, in my opinion, fighting for things like amnesty, which are things that Christ would have done.
Exactly.
We don't see that. Even progressive churches now, everyone is staying out of politics. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I'm disturbed by that because, the tax law prohibits people from endorsing candidates for public office. And the first Americans United complaint to the Internal Revenue Service was about a guy who had taken out a full-page ad in USA Today explaining how Bill Clinton was a sinner, and it had proof text, little Bible quotes to prove it. And then at the bottom it said, and if you vote for a sinner, you are a sinner too, another proof text from the Bible. So we said, well, this is outrageous. It cost $40,000 at the time. I think it was literally the first day I was there, and our wonderful communications people said, well, we should do something about this. And they did. And so the IRS did, in fact, remove the tax exemption. They appealed it to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, the second most powerful court in the country. And they, too, upheld the right of the IRS to remove tax exemptions for people who endorsed candidates. To me, that is really crossing the line. But talking about issues, I was going to go to law school, and eventually I did, but I there were no lawyers. There were some lawyers, but lawyer organizations during the Vietnam War didn't have a position. They didn't care about it. But churches did. People like William Sloane Coffin, a great preacher and advocate of social justice, he was an inspiration to me. I mean, an absolute inspiration, because he was speaking truth to power. And I figured if I could do something even remotely like that, that's what I wanted to do. But by no means did I think I would have these opportunities to do the things that I did, working for the United Church of Christ on these issues for not only people who resisted the war in very direct ways, but also for Vietnam veterans who managed to get shafted by the military justice system, such as it was. I failed my Army physical. I was so mad the night before I couldn't sleep. I was yelling. I was throwing things against the wall because I hated it. So I get there. I was wearing a worker's shirt with an armband with fake blood on it. And so the sergeant comes up and says, is this for some medical condition? I said, no, it's for a political position because I don't like this war. And he said, well, what's your basis for that? And I said, look up the Ninth Amendment. I didn't even know what that was at the time, but I figured it was far enough down that he probably didn't either. But so then I go for my physical, and I had written down something like, I have trouble sleeping or something. I get to the cardiologist, and the cardiologist says, do you know that you have a very serious heart condition? And I said, no, I don't know that. And he said, well, you're certainly not going to go into the Army. And I said, so what do you do about it? And he said, well, there isn't anything to do about it. So I, needless to say, got my 4F, and I could go to seminary without feeling guilty, because to this day, I don't believe that there should be a ministerial exemption from the draft. I think, I just don't believe in it, and I would not have accepted that. Now I didn't have to, which gave me a chance to do something else. And I went to seminary, and I thought I could always go to law school after the fact. And that's what I did. I worked for the United Church of Christ, and then I went at night to the Georgetown Law Center, which is just a few blocks from where the UCC office was. And I met so many people, so many Vietnam veterans, that there's a wonderful movie called One Life. One Life is based on a Jewish proverb that if you save one life, you save all of humanity. Mm. As I was watching this wonderful movie, I'd strongly urge your listeners to watch it. I could only think of one guy. His name was Weldon Merchant. He was been in the Army. He was in Vietnam twice. He was told, would you want to go back? And he said, I felt like I had to go back. So he drives to the gate of an Army base in Virginia and says, I'm Weldon Merchant. I'm here because I'm going back to Vietnam. And they said, who are you? And he gave his name. They said, you don't belong here. We don't even know who you are. So for 2 more weeks, he went back every week. He said, I'm Weldon Merchant. I came because I'm supposed to go back to Vietnam. And they said, stop coming back here. You don't belong here. We don't know who you are. So he gives up. He has a little girl at the time. He and his wife and the little girl are living in a car. Then they finally get an apartment. One Sunday, as he beautifully told me, I was getting my little girl ready for church, and there was a knock on the door. It was the FBI, and they said, are you Weldon Merchant? He said, yes. They said, well, you're a deserter. You've been gone for over 30 days. We're going to arrest you. They did briefly arrest him, and then they gave him an undesirable discharge, which sounds worse than the kind you get when you're actually court-martialed. And he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get any VA benefits, even though in his 2 previous tours in Vietnam, He had two Purple Hearts, which you get when friendly fire is what has hurt you. So he saw me on television and he called up and he told that much of the story about his little girl and getting her ready for church. And he said, would you represent me and get my discharge upgraded to something honorable? Because I really need my health care benefits. And I said, look, I know a lot about the discharge system. I was editing a military law magazine at the time. But I said, I haven't represented anyone. If you're okay with that, I'll represent you. And I did. And we went to the Pentagon. He came to breakfast. We were living out in Falls Church, Virginia. We go to the Pentagon. We go down in the basement where they're going to hold a hearing, and they give you a summary of the case. And so we read it. I thought, there's something very interesting here. So when the people on the panel said to me after about 45 minutes, so Mr. Lynn, you and Mr. Merchant, so much of your case depends on the claim that records were somehow missing. Why should we believe you? And I had to be kind of cautious here, but I said, well, sir, if you just look at the first sentence of the report that has been prepared for you, it says it is very difficult to consider Mr. Merchant's claims because so many of his records are missing. So needless to say, it won and we won and it made a huge difference. And he called me once years later and said how much it meant to get benefits. One of his injuries is to his back because someone threw a hand grenade in his unit. It blew off a tree and the tree fell on his back. And that was the treatment. And it's not unlike in today's, you hear stories, veterans who decided they wanted to serve their country, and now they're getting deported.
Yeah.
So all these people who claim to care deeply about veterans and everything, I think I was so concerned about veterans because I knew that the fact that I didn't go meant somebody else had to go.
Mm-hmm.
I believe you have to follow your conscience and you have to respect the damage that you have done to other human beings, not because you wanted to, but because that's the way things turned out.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's a beautiful story and heart-wrenching. And the moment that has been sitting with me so much recently, and it's probably my favorite moment working with you and working on Voices United, was at the show that you alluded to in LA, which was the culmination of that weekend of 50 shows. I remember sitting up in the green room. Sarah Silverman was there. I don't think Russell Brand was there yet. And maybe we can talk about him, but
We
he's
should.
taking a turn from where he was back then. But we were sitting up there, and Mary Gaucher was singing Mercy Now, which is one of the most beautiful songs.
Yep.
This was at a time when the world seemed a lot more together than it is today and now. Looking back, so much more mercy given to people than we are seeing now. How do you feel about that song? How does it sit with you in this moment that we're in right now in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful song, and I still am very much in touch with Mary, and Mary Gaucher is somebody everybody should listen to. I mean, really, it's just spectacular.
I would
The
love to have
idea,
her on the show. She has an amazing story too.
she
Yeah,
does,
she is in my heart. Yeah.
but the idea of mercy now is that we all need mercy now. We we need it. The churches need it. The politicians need it. Your neighbor needs it. And it's a remarkably strong feeling to have. And I think that you're right, that it is difficult now. There's a venality to what goes on now. So that it's not just that you can pick up a phone and get somebody in the White House. It's that the White House people they're venal. That is to say, they want people to suffer. There's no compassion. There's no empathy. Even Elon Musk said the biggest problem with the country was that we have too much empathy. How can you say that and be a serious person? Elon Musk didn't invent this stuff. He was a good investor, and I don't know what, he's starting a new political party now. I don't know what's going to happen with that. One of the people that I did meet during my professional life was Kurt Vonnegut. And he and Betty Friedan, who was another one of my wonderful heroines, and I did a press conference about something called the Mies Pornography Commission. And this was a time when feminists were really divided over this question of pornography. I think most people said, like, censorship is wrong, including that, and the fact that it has hateful images. We better learn to live with it. But a very strong and very sophisticated argument was being made by feminists who were opposed to pornography. So when Betty Friedan decides to do this press conference about halfway through, I was a little surprised. But the people on that commission were so strange. 11 members. And most of them were kind of right-wingers that were known to be right-wingers, or people who had weird theories about the First Amendment and why it didn't cover pornographic stuff. And then they even had a debate one afternoon about whether Michelangelo's statue of David was pornographic, because of course you can actually see David's penis. They decided it wasn't, but it was a narrow vote.
Oh my gosh.
But it gets worse, because one of the person who started this was a Catholic priest who had always liked, I mean, I didn't like his view of pornography, but he was helping kids. He founded Covenant House in New York City. And he told this dramatic story about how some homeless kids knocked on his door one night and said, "We don't have a place to stay." And that he developed this idea of Covenant House to help runaway youth. He wasn't such a nice guy. In fact, it was reported by a journalist in New York City that he was actually hiring young men to stay with him in his hotel room when he was on the commission business. And so the New York State Attorney General looked into it, went to the archdiocese and said, we're going to have to do something about it. And they said, okay, we'll do it. And so they moved him to India for a long time to avoid prosecution. Now, everybody that has a right-wing opposition to pornography is not a pedophile, is not a bad person. But, once you it's hard to stop it. I mean, you just can't stop it. And I remember that probably the weirdest thing that happened, there's this wonderful woman named Carol Vance. I believe she's still alive. She was a professor at Columbia University, and she used to write about sex panics. Like whenever something juvenile delinquency that's caused because of comic books. She wrote a whole thing about comic books, and she got fascinated by this because she thought that it was crazy to censor anything, but this again was seen as something that would harm everyone. So she and I hung around a lot, because we both went to all of their meetings around the country. When it came to Houston, Texas, they put in the Federal Register this notice that they'd be going to Houston on a field trip to visit 3 adult bookstores. So I called and I said, I want one of those seats. Then I called Carol. I said, you better call him like right now. Get the other seat. So we went along with them. And these were pretty scuzzy places, frankly. But the third one, you had to actually buy tokens in order to do something called buddy booths. Buddy booths, for the uninitiated, are these places where 2 or 3 people can stand up, put their token into a slot, and then watch a loop of a porno film.
Obsolete now, I'm sure, since we can get anything on our phone.
Yeah, absolutely. It probably doesn't even exist anymore. But it was, so I'm in there in the buddy booth with Ellen Levine, who's another wonderful woman who was the editor of Woman's Day magazine, and Henry Hudson, now regrettably a federal judge, but he had been the head of the Pornography Commission. And so we're watching 2 gay men wearing green rubber monster masks having sex. So Henry turns to me and says, well, Barry, when you testified before our commission, you said all films, even pornographic ones, contain ideas. What's the idea of this? And I looked at him and I said, Henry, how about try it? You might like it. And Ellen Levine, who was already kind of souring on it, but she could barely restrain her laughter. And then she wrote a report. Out of the four women on the panel, three of them wrote this dissenting report and basically said, this is junk science you're trying to use here. But it was literally the weirdest year of my life.
I did have a question for you. What is the strangest room you've ever been in? And I'm guessing that would probably be your answer.
That would be my answer. It was very small, but it was, I have a projector to watch movies now. And you know what else I discovered? In part from that, when all is said and done, they didn't like pictures, dirty pictures, but they didn't like the people who were having fun in those pictures either. The anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment for the majority of people in that was absolutely horrifying. They hated them. They constantly seemed to be searching for the worst single image they could find, particularly of gay men having sex, so that they could say, that's what it all is about. So one day, National Public Radio, because they were doing a lot of stories about this, and I was always on those stories, and one reporter said, well, when you saw all this porn, what did you think of it? And I said, well, a lot of it was really disgusting. But some of it turned me on. And so one of the lawyers in our office came up to me that morning and said, why did you say that? And I said, because I didn't want people to think I was a liar. Because if somebody asks the right question, I'm going to give them the right answer unless it intrudes on someone's privacy. But I mean, it's just, and then the Post asked that question of all of the members of the commission, and they said, well, I don't know, I don't think it did, but why don't you ask me in 10 years? But the irony of this is the ACLU at the time had a complete and preposterous view that included that it should be unconstitutional to regulate child pornography. And I called the president of the ACLU at the time and I said, nobody but me ends up having to try to defend that. And I said, it's stupid, frankly. And I think we should reevaluate it. And so he and Mort Halperin, who was the head of the Washington office, I said, I wrote this whole thing about creating a cause of action for sexual privacy, that if someone, and ironically, the ACLU at the time had this very broad privacy policy and endorsed the idea in New York State that if you were positioned next to a product that you didn't really like, that was an invasion of your privacy. It's the only state that has that broader privacy ruling. But when you think about it, I remember going to the board, the ACLU board, trying to defend my position about sexual privacy. They said, well, one guy, I won't mention names, but one guy said, if we give in on this, then the feminists will win, which I thought was stupid. And believe it or not, here's a guy about a year later was arrested for soliciting for prostitution in his state. Of course. I mean, it's just, but these things, if it is not a crime to do it, like you can't lie to a federal judge and you can't take pictures of 12-year-olds having sex. Inherent in the act is something that is illegal. If it's not that, I don't care what you do. I don't care what you say. There really is a strong belief that I have, and I think a lot of people do, that the best thing you can do for bad images, bad writings, is to write something else. Because it does make a difference. And in fact, the reason it's so important to protect everything. We defended the Palestine Information Office. During the Reagan years, they tried to shut it down. And everybody wanted to shut it down, Democrats and Republicans. But eventually, they had to avoid closing it. because it clearly was just political speech. These are Palestinians who wanted the same thing they want now, a homeland.
Yeah.
And it was everything. I briefly was on the board of the Kurt Vonnegut Library, and I did a couple of teaching seminars. One of them was called Everybody Hates Something, Why Not Ban Everything? And when you think about it, it's the same. Like if you ban alcohol ads, condom ads, you don't stop people from using those products. All you do is violate the First Amendment. And something like smoking, because tobacco ads, that was a huge problem. And all kinds of people wanted to ban it. I said, you cannot do this. Have you noticed any ads for cigarettes lately? No.
No, no.
No, it's because they don't advertise, because it doesn't work. It doesn't work. The thing that works is if your father smokes, if your best friend smokes, then you start to smoke. And as smoking declines, you know. But
Lots of
it was
vaping commercials, though.
there are a lot of vaping commercials, and I've never vaped. I did smoke something once. I smoked a lettuce cigarette, which is the most horrible thing it can. And then when I started college, I was smoking something called crooks, which are rum-soaked little cigars. I came home for Thanksgiving. I was smoking one in my living room, and my mother said, "Get out of here. You cannot smoke that." Because my father, basically died from how much he smoked. And it was, but it was really, it was something, you just can't stop people from thinking. I love the effort to ban TikTok, which combines the two fundamental excuses for banning anything. It will hurt the children and national security combined, because I'm sure the Chinese government cares deeply about, well, like what my neighbor's doing on TikTok. And then the children thing. And there's no question. I mean, body image, it's horrible. And it's horrible for teenagers and teenage girls in particular. But do we really think there would be no problem if there wasn't TikTok? Do they think that, Sylvia Sidney, she has large breasts? I wouldn't have known that, except there was a meme on, on I mean, what is absolutely wrong?
Yeah.
Bob Shear was an editor of Ramparts magazine, the first major publication during the Vietnam War that did in-depth reporting on what was wrong with the basic idea of going to war in Vietnam.
Mm.
I was impressed by it. I learned a great deal from him. I didn't meet him again until he was following the porno commission for the LA Times and Playboy magazine. But he just thought everything was kind of crazy. I mean, they just crazy people doing stuff. And it was, but so became good friends. He's still alive, but I think he's kind of out of journalism now.
Mm.
But Robert Shear, he's the guy who did the Playboy interview with Jimmy Carter, where Jimmy Carter said, "I have sinned in my heart many times, lust in my heart." So another honest man.
Yeah. My
Instinct.
gosh.
I know
Yeah.
because I've listened to some of your shows, and instinct. When should you trust it? And I want to tell you one story. My wife and I moved to New Hampshire to work at Dartmouth Medical School. What do I know about medicine? Nothing. I was supposed to come up and they gave me a job to teach doctors how to communicate their ideas with lay audiences. And our son had been very sick, and he was over it, and we just got burned out in Washington, and we were looking for another place to go. So we went there, and I came up a couple months earlier than the rest of the family. The first day I was there, the guy I was working for said, could you join me? We're having a meeting with the lawyers for Dartmouth Medical School, and there's an issue, and I want a lawyer there to talk about it. So here's what we're going to talk about. It's some kind of copyright problem. I knew very little, shall we say, about copyright law. But I sat there, they didn't know much about it either. And I thought, wait a minute. That and it was something else happened similar later in the day. Joanne, my wife, calls up and says, "How'd it go today?" And instead of being honest and saying, "This place is crazy," I said, "It was a little rough, but I'm sure it'll get better." It never got better. It
Uh-huh.
never, ever got better. And if I had done what my instinct said and just told the truth and gave those two stories from that very first day, I don't know what would have happened. But I suspect we would never have moved there.
But in whole, you can see why maybe that was your path, right?
It was. And but for that, and the fact that I talked to some people at Americans United, they had offered the job of director to someone else, and he decided not to take it. So two people on the staff called me because I had said to both of them, I don't like Dartmouth. I mean,
Uh,
how can you like a place where Dinesh D'Souza was dating Laura Ingraham? I mean, just there's something wrong with that. But the because I had been complaining to them, and woman who was running the legislative department said, well, they offered this job to somebody, but he didn't take it. Could I pass your name on? I said, absolutely. So then they called me, and I had a great interview, but my wife Joanne was up in Dartmouth for kind of a commitment of 2 years. So we lived apart for almost 2 years. I'd take the train from Washington to White River Junction, Vermont, where there was a train station, because you couldn't fly. They had a tiny airport. And one snowflake, it snowed like every other day up here. You couldn't fly in, so I started taking the train.
that's a lot
Wasn't
of time on the train.
But you can do stuff on the trains.
Yeah.
You can write stuff. It's an amazing process. Writing on airplanes is possible, but writing on a train is downright easy.
They're kind of built for it.
They are.
Barry, have you thought about legacy and, how you want people to be using these books and reading these books in the future?
It's a good question. I would like to be remembered as somebody who was scrupulously honest and who cared about people, including people I'd never met, and that I made some kind of contribution to trying to make the world a little better place. Whether I succeeded at that, I don't know. But I do know that I did what I had to do. At Chautauqua, where I been the last week, I was asked to be in the religion part of the event. There was comedy in the morning and religion in the afternoon. So I assumed, because Lewis Black was there and kind of asked me if he could peddle my name, I figured, well, maybe the comedians in the morning, they might use dirty words. And then the religion people would have to forgive them in the afternoon. But I said I wasn't going to do that. But these ideas, as I mentioned earlier, sin, evil, they are important words, and we need to recover them so that we don't do what I think too many people in the Democratic Party do now, which is like treating this as it's just another person. It's just another party. We'll get back to a better place. You might not get back to a better place. Your obligation is to stop the worst of the worst things from happening now. Not waiting for lawsuits, not waiting until maybe you get control of at least one house in the midterm elections. It's not enough. The biggest sin of being silent is the Holocaust. And I had an enormous trouble writing this 45-minute speech because I never start out, as you know, without some kind of a story, funny story. And then I'm going into the Holocaust. This is I think literally the worst example of the silence, particularly of religious communities, even the so-called, confessing church. Only 15% of that slightly more liberal group hadn't already endorsed Hitler as the chancellor. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who did in July of 1944, was part of a plot to assassinate Hitler. And he never thought he was doing the right thing. He thought he was doing a necessary thing, but he never thought that this was a morally responsible thing to be forced to do. So there's a movie about him called Bonhoeffer, which makes him sound like a superhero. Some of Bonhoeffer's relatives have criticized it heavily because they said it acts like this was something that he wanted to do, and he never wanted to do it. He just felt that it was necessary in these extreme circumstances. But he wasn't some guy who's going out and shoot somebody because they don't like him, they don't like her. So, but I think, the reason I wrote these books was COVID and the fact that three people, two women and one man, said I should write. The first woman that suggested this, I was having lunch in San Francisco, and she said, "Why don't you write a book? Why don't you write your memoirs?" And I said, "Who would read it?" And she said, "Number one, that's the wrong question. Because even if the only people who read it are your immediate family, your children, and your grandchildren, they might want to know what you did with your life. And the more that I forget about my past, the more sensible that advice was." And a lot of people have read it. It's not exactly a runaway bestseller, but a lot of interesting people have read it or blurbed it. And it reminds me of things I did. And it's very important. I wish people from my high school class in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I wish they would write memoirs. They don't have to write 3 volumes, but I mean, there's a guy whose everything he owned was burned in a fire. And he moved way up in the Pocono Mountains. I wonder, how did he get over that? And we had a major donor in California whose house burned to the ground.
Yeah.
I mean, but how do you get past that? How do you get through it and continue your life? I was a petrified little kid. Somehow I got elected to be the class speaker in my high school. We had 1,100 people in my high school senior class alone. So I remember this so well. I haven't thought about it till right now. My mother, good person, but she obsessed over me eating. So I'm supposed to eat. So I'm sitting there watching the Merv Griffin show. I said, Ma, I don't even want to eat. I'm too nervous. She said, "I'll just eat a little." So I ate a little, and then I threw up. But I made it through the speech, and I had to memorize. It's another thing I can't do is memorize anything. At Dickinson, I was in 2 plays. The first one was called The Apple. It was an avant-garde thing about something, and I played the part of a drunk who was wandering through the audience before it started and insulting people. I didn't have to remember anything. And then Under Milkwood was a very famous play, and it was a reading, though, a table reading of plays. So I didn't have to memorize anything. I could be Captain Cat.
The going through
Dylan
the
Thomas.
audience maybe was foreshadowing your relationship with Lewis Black. You were channeling him before you even knew him.
I think so. People should know that he is an extraordinarily nice man. I mean, he's a superb human being. Yeah. I like the people I met. One of the things I don't do, I don't take pictures with people. And so when it came down to putting pictures in my books, I didn't have pictures of a lot of people. And so I would suggest people take the pictures, even with your cell phone, because some of the pictures that are in it were pictures somebody took on my cell phone. And I think people at the end of their time really need to be able to say to themselves, I was as authentic as I can be, tried, I screwed up many times, but it doesn't matter because I tried my best to be a decent person to everyone I met. And if their politics were different, I still tried to be a decent person with them. I think that's all we can count on, but I think it's possibly the most important thing we can do when we look at the scope of our lives.
And Barry, I would say I think another word that we don't use as often as we should and have some fear around is the word love. And I would say that throughout your entire life, you have walked with love and given love to every single person that you have encountered. And that is something really, really extraordinary. And I am so glad that I've had the honor of walking with you through part of your life, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
I've enjoyed this tremendously.
Thank you for tuning in to Goddess in Training. I hope something in this episode stirred your knowing or softened your heart. If it spoke to you, share it with someone who needs it, or leave a review or comment to help others find us. If you're watching on YouTube, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to hear more conversations like this, please consider supporting Goddess in Training on Patreon. For more tools and offerings to deepen your intuition practice, visit goddessintraining.online. You can also join the Scroll of Seshat on Substack for twice-weekly stories of how I followed my intuition. The music for Goddess in Training is Madre Ayahuasca by Arkawa, and you can find more of his music in the link to his website in the show notes. Remember, your intuition is not a mystery, it's a memory. Keep listening.
Resplandor del fuego, estrellita, tabaco santo, fuerza de rapel, soplo de luz, soplo encantado, viajecito, bendición del cielo, fortaleza, tigrecito de la selva.